Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another gentle journey through history's quietest corners. Tonight, we're going to drift into the wild, snow-dusted world of the Rocky Mountains, where the air bites cold and the stars hang so close you might reach up and touch them. We'll walk beside the mountain men, those rugged souls who wandered far from civilization, wrapped in buckskin and fur, seeking fortune and freedom in a land that could kill you as easily as it could cradle you. Before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Dim your lights, let the glow of your screen soften. Rest your head on your pillow, pull that blanket up around your shoulders, and let your breathing slow. Tonight's story is long and winding, filled with crackling fires, the scent of pine smoke, and the gentle rhythm of survival in the wilderness. And if this calm journey helps you unwind, if it carries you softly into sleep, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure, just you, me, and the mountains. Now, close your eyes if you'd like. Let's go back to a time when the Rockies were unmapped, untamed, and utterly silent except for the wind. Let me tell you about the first time a man realizes the mountains don't care about him. It's a humbling thing, really. Picture this. It's the autumn of 1822, and you're a young trapper, maybe 19, maybe 22, fresh from St. Louis with stars in your eyes and a contract with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company tucked in your coat. You've heard the stories. Fortunes made in beaver pelts. Freedom like you've never known. The kind of life where no man tells you when to wake or where to go. But nobody told you about the cold. Your first night alone in the high country, you make camp in a little hollow between two granite shoulders, where the wind doesn't hit quite so hard. The sun sets fast up here, faster than it ever did back home, and suddenly the temperature drops like a stone into a well. You've got a small fire going, pine and spruce, because that's what's around, and the smoke rises in a thin, wavering line that disappears into the deepening blue above. You've laid out your bedroll, a wool blanket, maybe two if you were smart, and a buffalo robe you traded for back at the rendezvous. The buffalo robe is heavy, stiff with cold, and smells like the animal it came from, musky, wild, a little bit like wet dog if we're being honest. But it's warm. Oh, it's warm. You spread it fur side down on a patch of ground you've cleared of rocks and pine needles, then layer your blankets on top. Now, here's a little trick the old-timers taught you, if you were lucky enough to meet one before you headed out. You don't sleep directly on the ground. Not if you want to wake up. The earth sucks the heat right out of you, slow and steady, like a thief in the night. So you gather pine boughs, lots of them, and you lay them down thick, creating a soft, springy mattress that lifts you a few inches off that frozen soil. It smells incredible, by the way. Fresh pine, resinous and sharp, mixing with the wood smoke. If they could bottle that scent, they'd make a fortune. You settle in, wrapping yourself tight. The fire crackles and pops, throwing shadows that dance against the rock walls. Somewhere far off, a wolf howls, a long, lonely sound that makes your spine tingle. You tell yourself it's far away. You tell yourself you're safe. And then you try to sleep. But here's the thing about sleeping in the mountains. It's not like sleeping in a bed. It's not even like sleeping on the ground back home, where the worst you might encounter is a lumpy root or a curious raccoon. No, this is different. The cold creeps in at the edges. Your nose is freezing. Your ears ache. You've got your hat pulled down low and your collar turned up, but somehow the chill finds a way through. You scrunch deeper into the buffalo robe, pulling it over your head, and suddenly you're breathing your own warm, stale air in a little cave of fur and wool. It's not comfortable, exactly, but it's survivable. And that's the name of the game out here. You drift in and out. The fire needs tending every couple of hours, so you never really fall into that deep, dreaming sleep. You wake up, shivering, and crawl out long enough to toss a few more logs on, blow on the coals, watch the flames lick back to life. Then you burrow back in, and the whole cycle starts again. By morning, you're stiff, sore, and covered in a fine layer of frost that's settled on the outside of your bedroll. But you're alive, and you've learned your first lesson. The mountains are beautiful, but they don't coddle you. Now, let's talk about food for a moment, because food is fuel, and fuel is warmth. That first night, you probably ate something simple, maybe a piece of salt pork you brought from the trading post, fried up in a little pan over the fire until it was crispy and glistening with fat. Salt pork was a staple for mountain men, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Pork belly cured in salt until it's hard as a rock and lasts for months without spoiling. You'd slice off a chunk, fry it up, and let the grease soak into a piece of hardtack, that dense, tooth-breaking biscuit that was more of a weapon than a food, honestly. Hardtack, by the way, was invented long before the mountain men got their hands on it. Sailors had been eating the stuff for centuries. It was cheap, it lasted forever, and if you soaked it in coffee or stew, it became almost edible. Almost. Think of it like the world's worst cracker. No flavor, no moisture, just pure, stubborn carbohydrate. But when you're burning thousands of calories a day just to stay warm, you'll eat anything. After your meal, if you can call it that, you'd wash it down with water from a nearby stream, ice cold and so pure it made your teeth ache. Maybe you boiled some coffee if you had the beans. Coffee was precious out here, almost as valuable as ammunition. The mountain men loved their coffee thick and strong, boiled right in the pot with the grounds floating on top. You'd sip it slow, savoring the bitter warmth, and feel it spread through your chest like liquid courage. And then back to the bedroll. Back to the buffalo robe. Back to the endless dance of staying warm. Let me tell you something about buffalo robes, because they were everything to a mountain man. A good robe could mean the difference between life and death on a freezing night. The American bison, those massive, shaggy creatures that roamed the plains in herds so large they looked like a moving carpet, had evolved to survive winters that could drop to 40 below zero. Their fur was dense, layered, with a coarse outer coat and a soft, insulating undercoat that trapped heat like nothing else. The native peoples had known this for thousands of years, of course. They'd been using buffalo robes long before any Europeans set foot on this continent. And when the trappers and traders arrived, they quickly learned to follow suit. You could trade for a robe at a rendezvous, or if you were brave or foolish, you could hunt a buffalo yourself. Either way, once you had one, you took care of it. You kept it dry, you aired it out when you could, and you never, ever left it behind. Some men got fancy with their sleeping arrangements. They'd sew two robes together to make a kind of sleeping bag, for on the inside, and crawl in like a bear going into hibernation. Others would use one robe as a mattress and another as a blanket, creating a sandwich of warmth with themselves as the filling. It sounds cozy, doesn't it? And it was in a rough, scratchy, slightly smelly kind of way. But even with all that fur, the cold still found you. It crept in through gaps, through the places where the robe didn't quite cover, through the thin spots worn down by use. And so you learned to sleep curled up tight, knees to chest, conserving every bit of heat your body could produce. You learned to sleep light too, because out here, you weren't the only one looking for a warm place to spend the night. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, they were all out there, and some of them were curious about the strange two-legged creature wrapped in fur by the fire. Most of the time, they'd leave you alone. Most of the time. But you kept your rifle close, just in case. And you learned to sleep with the sounds of the wilderness as your lullaby. The wind sighed through the pines, a soft, endless whisper. The fire crackled and hissed. An owl hooted from somewhere in the darkness, its call low and haunting. These weren't the sounds of danger. They were the sounds of life, of a world that hummed along whether you were there or not. It's strange, but after a while, those sounds became comforting. They meant you weren't alone. They meant the world was still turning, still breathing. And as you lay there, wrapped in buffalo and wool, staring up at a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, you'd feel it, a kind of peace that's hard to find anywhere else. The Rockies in the early 1800s were a place of extremes. Brutal and beautiful, harsh and holy. And the men who slept under those stars learned to live in that tension, balancing on the edge between comfort and catastrophe. So there you are on your first cold night in the mountains, learning the rhythm of survival, learning to tend the fire, to wrap yourself tight, to drift in and out of sleep while the world freezes around you. And now, let your mind drift to the next chapter of this story, where we'll talk about the tricks and techniques these men used to keep warm when the temperatures really dropped. Imagine waking up one morning, weeks into your trapping expedition, and stepping out of your bedroll to find the world transformed. Overnight, a foot of snow has fallen, muffling every sound, turning the forest into a cathedral of white and silence. Your breath hangs in the air in thick clouds, and when you touch the metal of your rifle barrel, it's so cold it burns. This is when you realize that everything you thought you knew about staying warm was just the beginning. The mountain men, those grizzled, weathered souls who made the Rockies their home from the 1820s through the 1840s, developed a whole repertoire of techniques for surviving the cold. Some of these methods were learned from native tribes, who had been thriving in these mountains for thousands of years. Others were born of desperation, trial and error, and the kind of stubborn ingenuity that comes from refusing to freeze to death. Let's start with fire, because fire is life. But not just any fire, a proper mountain man's fire, built with knowledge and care. You've probably heard of the campfire arrangement where you stack logs in a pyramid or a teepee shape. That's fine for a summer night, for sitting around and telling stories. But when you're trying to survive a night where the temperature drops to 10 below zero, you need something more efficient. You need what the old-timers called a reflector fire. Here's how it works. You build a fire in front of a large rock face, or if you're clever, you construct a wall of stacked logs behind your fire. This wall reflects the heat back toward you, essentially doubling the warmth you receive. Then you position yourself between the fire and another reflective surface. Maybe another rock, maybe your own makeshift windbreak of pine boughs and hides. Now you're in a little pocket of warmth, with heat coming at you from multiple directions. Some trappers would build 2 fires, one on either side of their sleeping spot, and lie between them like a piece of meat on a spit. Sounds excessive, doesn't it? But when your life depends on staying warm, excessive is just another word for prepared. The type of wood mattered too. Pine and spruce burned fast and hot, throwing sparks and filling the air with that wonderful resinous smoke. But they didn't last. For a long, cold night, you wanted hardwood, oak if you could find it, or aspen, which burned slower and steadier. The trick was to build up a bed of coals, that deep, glowing mass of embers that radiates heat for hours without much flame. And speaking of coals, here's a technique that might surprise you: hot rocks. Before settling in for the night, a smart trapper would select several smooth, hand-sized stones and nestle them into the coals of his fire. After an hour or so, when the stones were thoroughly heated, he'd carefully extract them, using a stick or a piece of leather, because touching them directly would definitely ruin your day, and wrap them in cloth or bury them in the foot of his bedroll. These hot stones acted like primitive heating pads, radiating warmth for hours. Your feet would stay toasty, and that warmth would spread up through your body, keeping you comfortable well into the night. The native peoples had been using this technique for generations, and the trappers adopted it with enthusiasm. Now, let's talk about clothing, because what you wore determined how well you slept almost as much as where you slept. Layering was everything. You didn't just throw on a coat and call it good. No, you built up your defenses against the cold one layer at a time, creating pockets of trapped air that acted as insulation. First, you had your base layer, a wool or linen shirt, worn directly against the skin. Wool is magical, really. Even when it gets wet, and it will get wet from sweat or snow or an unexpected tumble into a creek, it still insulates. It traps heat in its fibers and keeps your core temperature stable. The mountain men lived in their wool shirts, wearing them until they were stiff with dirt and smoke and probably standing up on their own. Over the shirt, you'd add a buckskin jacket or coat. Buckskin, leather made from deer or elk hide, was the uniform of the mountain man. It was tough, flexible, and when properly tanned and smoked, it was reasonably water-resistant. The native peoples were masters of this craft, using a mixture of animal brains and other materials to tan the hides until they were soft and supple. The smoking process gave the buckskin that distinctive golden brown color and a smell that was, well, let's call it earthy. It smelled like smoke and animal and the wild outdoors, and after a while, you stopped noticing it. On top of the buckskin, in the coldest weather, you'd add a capote, a heavy wool coat with a hood, often made from Hudson's Bay blankets. These blankets, traded by the Hudson's Bay Company, were iconic in the fur trade. They were thick, warm, and marked with distinctive stripes in colors like red, yellow, green, and indigo. A trapper might trade an entire season's worth of beaver pelts for one of these blankets, then cut it up and sew it into a coat that would last him years. Your legs got similar treatment: wool or buckskin pants, sometimes leather leggings over the top for extra protection against wind and brush. And on your feet, oh, your feet were critical. Moccasins were the footwear of choice, made from soft leather and molded to fit your feet perfectly. In winter, you'd stuff them with grass or fur for insulation, and you'd wrap your feet in strips of wool or fur before sliding them into the moccasins. Some trappers wore multiple pairs of moccasins, one inside the other, creating layers of protection. And at night, you'd sleep with your moccasins inside your bedroll with you, tucked under your arm or against your belly. Because if your moccasins froze solid during the night, and they would, you'd spend a miserable morning trying to thaw them out before you could put them on. Better to keep them warm and dry with your body heat. Let's pause for a moment and talk about food again, because I promised you a mix of sweet, savory, and surprising, and we're overdue for a culinary interlude. On a cold night, after a long day of checking trap lines or skinning beaver, a mountain man might treat himself to something special, pemmican. Now, pemmican might not sound special to you, but out in the wilderness, it was a lifesaver. Pemmican was invented by the indigenous peoples of North America, and it's essentially a high-energy survival food made from dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries. Here's how you make it. Take strips of buffalo, deer, or elk meat and dry them completely, either in the sun or over a slow fire, until they're hard and brittle. Then pound that dried meat into a powder using stones. Mix in rendered fat, tallow, usually, which acts as a binder and a source of calories. If you're feeling fancy, add some dried berries, chokecherries, service berries, whatever you can find, for a touch of sweetness and vitamin C. Press the whole mixture into cakes or pack it into rawhide pouches, and you've got a food that will last for months, even years, without spoiling. A small piece of pemmican could keep you going all day, and on a cold night, eating a chunk of it felt like swallowing a little bit of the sun. The fat melted on your tongue, rich and satisfying, and the meat gave you something to chew on. The berries added a tart, almost fruity note that cut through the heaviness. Some trappers loved pemmican. Others tolerated it. A few hated it with a passion, comparing it to eating candle wax mixed with sawdust. But everyone ate it because it was efficient, portable, and packed with calories. If you were near a stream or river, you might catch some trout for supper. Trout in the Rocky Mountain streams are plentiful and beautiful, speckled with red and orange, their flesh pink and delicate. You'd clean them, skewer them on a green stick, and roast them over the fire until the skin crisped and the meat flaked apart. A little salt, if you had it, and you were in heaven. No fancy seasonings, no butter, just pure, simple fish and smoke. And if you got lucky, really lucky, you might come across a patch of wild berries even in late autumn, the last stubborn holdouts before winter. Service berries, huckleberries, thimbleberries, these little jewels were bursting with flavor, sweet and tart and fleeting. You'd eat them by the handful, staining your fingers purple, and for a moment, the harshness of the wilderness would fade and you'd just be a person enjoying something delicious. But back to staying warm. Because as much as food helped, as much as fire and clothing mattered, the real secret to surviving those freezing nights was your shelter. Most of the time, a mountain man didn't have a permanent shelter. He was constantly on the move, following the beaver and the seasons. So he became an expert at improvising, at reading the landscape and finding or creating protection from the elements. The simplest shelter was just a lean-to, a framework of sticks propped against a fallen log or a low branch covered with pine boughs, bark, or hides. It wasn't much, but it blocked the wind, and that made all the difference. Wind is the enemy of warmth. It strips away the heat from your body faster than anything, even colder air. So if you could get out of the wind, you were already halfway to a comfortable night. If you had time and materials, you might build something more substantial. A wickiup, borrowed from native designs, with a conical frame of poles covered in layers of brush and hides. Or if you were part of a larger trapping brigade, you might set up a canvas tent, a luxury that some of the bigger fur companies provided. But canvas tents had their own challenges. They didn't insulate well, and on a truly cold night, frost would form on the inside walls, raining down on you if you brushed against them. Still, they were better than nothing, and they were reusable, which counted for a lot. And now, let your mind drift to the next chapter, where we'll venture deeper into winter, into the heart of the coldest months, when survival became an act of quiet defiance against the mountain's indifference. There's a kind of silence that only exists in the deep winter mountains, when snow has fallen so thick and so often that it muffles everything. The world becomes soft, rounded, like someone has draped a white quilt over the sharp edges of reality. You can walk through the forest and hear nothing but the crunch of your own footsteps and the faint whisper of your breath. It's beautiful. It's also terrifying. By January or February, the dead heart of winter, the trappers who hadn't retreated to a fort or a trading post were living in a kind of limbo, a suspended existence where every day was about making it to the next day. The beaver weren't moving much. They were tucked away in their lodges under the ice. The game was scarce, bedded down or migrated to lower elevations. And the cold, oh, the cold was relentless. Temperatures in the high Rockies during this period could plunge to 30 or 40 below zero, sometimes colder. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Your breath crystallizes in the air, and if you're not careful, it freezes on your beard and eyelashes, turning you into a living ice sculpture. Your fingers and toes go numb no matter how many layers you've wrapped them in, and frostbite becomes a constant threat. So how did the mountain men sleep through this? How did they survive when the nights stretched long and dark and the sun barely seemed to have the strength to climb above the peaks? The answer is, carefully, and with a lot of ingenuity. First, they hunkered down. This wasn't the time for wandering or exploring new territory. This was the time to find a good spot, preferably a south-facing slope where the sun might hit for a few precious hours each day, near water that hadn't frozen solid, with plenty of firewood close at hand, and dig in. Some trappers would build what's called a dugout or a winter camp. This wasn't anything fancy. It was basically a hole in the ground, excavated into a hillside, with a roof of logs and sod. The earth itself became insulation, protecting the interior from the worst of the wind and cold. You'd build your fire at the entrance, and the smoke would curl up and out while the heat radiated into your little cave. Inside, it was dark, cramped, and smoky. It smelled like dirt and sweat and smoke and whatever you were cooking. But it was warm, relatively speaking, and that was all that mattered. If you were lucky enough to be trapping with a partner or a small group, you'd all pile into that dugout together, sharing body heat like a litter of puppies. There was no privacy, no personal space. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder, feet to face, whatever configuration fit. And you'd wake up coughing from the smoke, your eyes burning, your back aching from the hard-packed earth. But you'd wake up, and that was the point. Solo trappers, men who preferred solitude or who'd lost their partners to accidents, illness, or disagreements, had it harder. They had no one to share the burden of keeping the fire going through the night, no one to warm them if they started to slip into hypothermia. These men had to be twice as careful, twice as prepared. Some of them developed a technique of banking their fires before sleep. They'd build up a large fire, let it burn down to a massive bed of coals, and then cover those coals with a thick layer of ash and dirt. This slowed the burning, creating a kind of slow-release heat source that would last most of the night. In the morning, they'd carefully uncover the coals, add kindling, blow gently, and coax the fire back to life. It's a delicate process, almost meditative. There's something deeply satisfying about waking a fire from its slumber, watching the first tiny flames lick up from the embers, feeding it small sticks until it's roaring again. Let me tell you about a meal that sustained these men through the darkest months. Boudin. Now, boudin isn't something you'd find in a modern cookbook, but to a mountain man, it was a delicacy. Boudin was made from the intestines of buffalo or other large game. The trappers would take a length of intestine, clean it out, as much as they cared to, anyway, and then stuff it with a mixture of chopped meat, fat, and sometimes wild onions or other foraged plants. Then they'd roast it over the fire until the casing crisped up and the filling was hot and steaming. The result was like a rustic wilderness sausage, rich, fatty, intensely flavorful. The casing had a bit of chew to it, and the filling was savory and satisfying in a way that only freshly cooked meat over an open fire can be. It was messy to eat, grease running down your chin, but on a night when the wind was howling and the snow was piling up outside your shelter, that hot, greasy boudin was a reminder that you were still alive, still capable of finding comfort in small things. The French-Canadian voyageurs, who often worked alongside the American trappers, were particularly fond of boudin, and they'd argue passionately about the best way to prepare it. Some liked it plain, just meat and fat. Others insisted on adding wild garlic or onions. A few even tried adding berries, creating a sweet-savory combination that was adventurous, let's say. Another winter staple was stew, thick, hearty stews made from whatever meat was available, cooked low and slow in a pot hung over the fire. You'd toss in chunks of venison or elk, maybe some wild turnips or roots if you could dig them up from under the snow, a handful of dried peas if you'd been wise enough to pack some from the last trading post. You'd let it simmer for hours, the liquid reducing down to a thick, rich gravy that coated everything. On the coldest nights, you'd eat that stew straight from the pot, taking turns with your partner if you had one, blowing on each spoonful to cool it just enough not to burn your tongue. And when you were done, when you'd scraped the bottom of the pot and soaked up the last of the gravy with a piece of hardtack, you'd feel that warmth settle into your belly, radiating outward, and you'd know you had enough fuel to make it through the night. But food could only do so much. The real challenge of deep winter was psychological. The days were short, terribly short. The sun might rise at 8 in the morning and set by 4:30 in the afternoon, leaving you with more than 15 hours of darkness to endure. And in that darkness, alone or nearly alone in a vast wilderness, your mind could play tricks on you. Some trappers talked to themselves, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions. Others sang old songs from home, hymns, bawdy tavern tunes, whatever they could remember. The sound of a human voice, even your own, was comforting. It pushed back against the silence and the dark. A few men kept journals, writing by firelight in small, leather-bound books they'd bought at the trading posts. These journals are precious historical documents now, filled with terse entries. February 3rd, snowed all day. Killed a rabbit. Fire low. But between those spare lines, you can sense the loneliness, the grinding daily struggle. And then there were the dreams. Something about the combination of exhaustion, cold, isolation, and the thin air at high altitude made for vivid, strange dreams. Men reported dreaming of home, of warm kitchens and soft beds and the faces of people they hadn't seen in years. They dreamed of feasts, tables groaning with roasted meats and fresh bread and pies and cakes, all the foods they couldn't have out here. They dreamed of women, of course, and warmth and laughter. Some of those dreams were so real that waking up was cruel, almost physically painful. You'd open your eyes to the smoky darkness of your dugout or the frost-covered interior of your tent, and for a moment, you'd feel the loss of that dream like a weight on your chest. But you'd shake it off. You'd crawl out of your bedroll, tend the fire, check your traps if the weather allowed, and get on with the business of surviving. There's a kind of quiet heroism in that, don't you think? No glory, no recognition, just the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. Let me tell you about one more winter food, something that might surprise you: dried fruit. The trappers who had the foresight or the luck to trade for dried apples or peaches at the rendezvous hoarded them like gold. A few pieces of dried apple, stewed in a pot with a little water and maybe some sugar if you had it, could transform a bleak evening into something almost festive. The fruit would rehydrate, plumping up and releasing its sweetness into the water, and you'd end up with a kind of rough compote. It was tart and sweet and tasted like summer, like orchards and sunshine and everything the winter wasn't. You'd eat it slowly, savoring each piece, letting the flavors linger on your tongue. Some trappers would save their dried fruit for special occasions, a holiday, maybe, or a partner's birthday. Others couldn't resist and would eat it all within the first few weeks, leaving themselves with nothing but pemmican and salt pork for the rest of the winter. It's funny how something so simple, a piece of dried apple, can become so significant when you're stripped down to the basics of existence. As winter dragged on, the routines became almost ritualistic. Wake up while it's still dark. Revive the fire. Melt snow for water. Eat something, anything, to start the metabolism. Check the traps, though you know there's probably nothing. Gather more firewood, a task that never ends because the fire never stops. Return to camp. Cook a meal. Repair your gear. Mend a torn moccasin. Sharpen your knife. Oil your rifle. Tend the fire. Eat again. Sit. Repeat. It's a rhythm, a pattern, and it keeps you sane. It gives structure to the emptiness. And on clear nights, when the clouds parted and the sky opened up, you'd step outside your shelter and look up at the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, so dense and bright that you could almost believe you could reach up and touch it. The cold air was so clear that the stars didn't twinkle. They burned, steady and fierce. On those nights, despite everything, the cold, the loneliness, the constant struggle, you'd feel something close to awe. You were living on the edge of the world, in a place few people would ever see, doing something few people would ever attempt. And in that moment, wrapped in your furs, your face numb from the cold but your chest full of something you couldn't quite name, you'd understand why men came to the mountains and stayed. And now, let your mind drift to the next chapter, where we'll talk about the strange and surprising things trappers did to stay warm and the resourcefulness born of desperation. Here's something most people don't know about the mountain men. They were incredible problem solvers. They had to be. When you're 100 miles from the nearest trading post, and something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, you can't just order a replacement online or run to the hardware store. You figure it out or you die. This spirit of resourcefulness extended to staying warm. Over the years, the trappers developed a whole array of unusual, sometimes bizarre, techniques for keeping themselves alive through the coldest nights. For instance, did you know that some mountain men would sleep with dogs? Not as companions, though that was part of it, but as living, breathing heat sources. A large dog, curled up against your back or chest inside your bedroll, could add a significant amount of warmth. The dog's body temperature is higher than a human's, and that heat radiates through the layers of fur and blanket, creating a cozy little microclimate. The dogs, for their part, seemed to enjoy the arrangement. They were out of the wind, warm, and close to their human, which is all a dog really wants anyway. And in the morning, they'd wake you up by licking your face or poking you with a cold nose, which was probably less pleasant but undeniably effective. Some trappers traveled with multiple dogs, using them to carry supplies or pull small sleds, and on the coldest nights, they'd invite all of them into the bedroll. Imagine a grown man and 2 or 3 shaggy, smelly dogs all piled together under a buffalo robe, a tangle of limbs and tails and fur. It's ridiculous and charming in equal measure. Then there was the practice of using heated stones, which I mentioned earlier, but it went further than you might think. Some trappers would heat larger, flat stones and place them not just in their bedrolls but around the perimeter of their sleeping area, creating a barrier of warmth. Others would wrap heated stones in leather and tuck them inside their shirts, against their bellies, where the heat could warm their core. One particularly inventive trapper, his name lost to history, but his technique passed down through stories, would heat a stone and place it in a leather pouch, then tie that pouch around his waist like a belt. He claimed he could sleep anywhere as long as he had his belt warmer. It sounds uncomfortable and probably was, but it worked. Let's talk about another unusual food, bone marrow. Now, when a trapper butchered an animal, deer, elk, moose, whatever, he didn't waste anything. The meat was eaten or dried. The hide was used for clothing or trade. The sinew was saved for sewing, and the bones? The bones were cracked open, and the rich, fatty marrow inside was scooped out and eaten. Bone marrow is an acquired taste, I'll grant you. It's intensely rich, buttery, with a slightly mineral flavor that can be off-putting if you're not expecting it. But it's packed with fat and nutrients, and on a cold night, eating a spoonful of warm marrow felt like swallowing concentrated energy. Some trappers would roast the bones directly in the fire, letting the marrow heat up inside until it was bubbling and soft. Then they'd crack the bone open and slurp it out, savoring the richness. Others would add marrow to their stews, letting it melt into the broth and enrich the entire pot. There's a reason the phrase, "stick to your ribs," exists. Foods like bone marrow, like pemmican, like fatty stews, they sustain you in a way that lighter foods can't. They give you the fuel to keep your internal furnace burning through the long, cold night. Now, let's talk about something a bit sweeter: wild honey. Yes, honey in the Rockies. It wasn't common and it wasn't easy to get, but if you found a bee tree, a hollow tree where wild bees had built a hive, it was like striking gold. Harvesting wild honey was dangerous. Bees don't appreciate having their home invaded, and they'll defend it with everything they've got. But a desperate or daring trapper might smoke out the bees using a torch of damp grass and pine boughs, creating enough smoke to calm them, or at least confuse them, and then hack into the tree to reach the honeycomb. The honey itself was dark, almost amber, and tasted like the forest, floral and earthy, with notes of pine and wildflowers. It was thick and sticky, and you'd eat it straight from the comb, wax and all, because you couldn't afford to be picky. A small pot of wild honey could last weeks if you rationed it, adding a spoonful to your coffee or drizzling it over a piece of fried bread, if you had any flour left, or just eating it straight when you needed a boost of sweetness and energy. There's something almost magical about honey, especially when you're living a hard, cold life in the wilderness. It's pure and golden and sweet, a reminder that not everything out here is trying to kill you. Some things, rare, precious things, are trying to help you live. But back to the cold, because the cold was always there, always waiting. Another trick the mountain men used was to sleep with their clothes on. All of them. Every layer. It sounds obvious, maybe, but there's a temptation when you're crawling into your bedroll to strip down a bit to get comfortable. But comfort, in this case, is the enemy of survival. The more layers you keep on, the more insulation you have, the better your chances of staying warm. So you'd sleep fully dressed: shirt, jacket, pants, leggings, moccasins, hat, gloves if you had them. The only thing you might remove is your coat, and that's only so you could drape it over the top of your buffalo robe as an extra layer. You'd tuck your hands into your armpits and pull your knees up to your chest, making yourself as small as possible to conserve heat. It wasn't comfortable. The layers bunched up and twisted around you, and you woke up with creases in your skin and an ache in your joints. But you woke up, and that's what counted. Some trappers even slept with their rifles. Not just nearby, but actually in the bedroll with them. The rifle was precious, irreplaceable, really, and in the coldest weather, the metal and wood could contract and crack if left out in the open. So you'd keep it close, wrapped in a piece of cloth or leather to protect it from moisture, and let your body heat keep it from freezing. It was also a defensive measure. If something, a bear, a wolf, or even a hostile human, approached your camp in the night, you wanted your weapon within arm's reach. Sleeping with your rifle was just good sense. Now, let's talk about something that might sound strange but was a lifesaver for many trappers: animal bladders. Yes, bladders. When you butchered an animal, You'd save the bladder, clean it out, and use it as a water container. But bladders had another use. If you filled one with warm water or warm snowmelt, sealed it, and tucked it into your bedroll, it acted like a primitive hot water bottle. The bladder would stay warm for hours, radiating heat into your sleeping space. And when it finally cooled down, you could drink the water inside, because staying hydrated was just as important as staying warm. Dehydration in cold weather is sneaky. You don't feel as thirsty because you're not sweating, but you're still losing moisture with every breath, every trip outside to gather wood. So the bladder served double duty, warmth and water. Efficient, practical, and just a little bit gross if you thought about it too hard. Let me tell you about another winter food, something that might make you smile: Johnny cakes. If a trapper had access to cornmeal, and that was a big if, depending on how long it had been since his last resupply, he could make Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes are about as simple as food gets: cornmeal, water, a little salt if you have it, mixed into a thick batter and fried in a pan over the fire. They're dense, slightly sweet from the corn, and they soak up grease and stew like nobody's business. The name Johnny cake might come from journey cake, because they were easy to make on the trail. Or it might come from something else entirely. Historians argue about it. But whatever the origin, these little cakes were a welcome change from hardtack and pemmican. You'd cook them until they were golden and crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and eat them hot, maybe with a smear of bear grease or a drizzle of honey if you'd been lucky enough to find some. They were filling, warming, and tasted like home, or at least like the idea of home, which was almost as good. The mountain men were also masters of reading the weather. They had to be. Out here, a sudden storm could mean the difference between a mildly uncomfortable night and a deadly one. They learned to watch the sky, to notice the subtle shifts in wind direction, the way the clouds moved, the behavior of the animals. When the birds went quiet and the deer started moving to lower ground, you knew a big storm was coming. When the wind shifted to the north and the temperature dropped suddenly, you prepared for a hard freeze. And they learned to trust their instincts, that deep, primal sense that something was wrong. If you woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling of unease, you didn't ignore it. You checked the fire, you looked outside, you made sure everything was secure. More than one trapper survived because he listened to that inner voice and took action before disaster struck. There's a kind of wisdom in that, don't you think? A reminder that we're still animals, still connected to the natural world in ways we don't fully understand. On the rare occasions when a trapper had access to flour, sugar, and fat, maybe after a successful trading session or a particularly lucky hunt, he might make something special: fried dough. Just a simple dough, fried in fat until it puffed up and turned golden, then dusted with a little sugar if any was available. It's not much. It's not a fancy pastry or a layered cake. But when you bite into it, hot, crispy, sweet, and greasy, it's a small piece of joy. It's a reminder that life isn't just about surviving. Sometimes it's about finding a moment of pleasure in the midst of hardship. And now, let your mind drift to the next chapter, where we'll explore the communal aspects of mountain life, the times when trappers came together, and the warmth that comes not from fire or fur, but from companionship. For all the talk of solitary trappers braving the wilderness alone, the truth is that many mountain men traveled in pairs or small groups. There's safety in numbers, of course, but more than that, there's companionship. And in the long, dark winter nights, companionship could be as vital as any buffalo robe or roaring fire. Imagine you and your partner, maybe a man you've known for years, maybe someone you met at last summer's rendezvous and decided to team up with, have made camp in a sheltered draw. The wind howls outside, but inside your shared lean-to, with a fire crackling at the entrance and both of you wrapped in your robes, there's a kind of comfort that goes beyond physical warmth. You talk about everything and nothing, about the traps you set that day and whether they'll yield anything, about the beaver populations and where the animals might be moving, about the price of pelts at the trading posts and whether it's worth another season in the mountains or if it's time to head back to civilization. You tell stories. Tall tales, mostly exaggerated accounts of close calls with bears, of rivers crossed and mountains climbed, of the biggest beaver you ever caught and the one that got away. The truth doesn't matter so much as the telling, the way the story unfolds and the laughter or gasps it provokes. You might pull out a deck of cards, battered and stained, but still functional, and play a few hands of poker or euchre by firelight. The stakes are low. Who has to gather firewood tomorrow morning, or who gets the last piece of jerky? But the game gives structure to the evening, something to focus on other than the cold and the dark pressing in from all sides. Some mountain men formed deep, lasting friendships in the wilderness. They became partners in the truest sense, relying on each other for survival, trusting each other with their lives. They'd share their food, their blankets, their stories, and their silences. And those silences were important too. There's a kind of companionship that doesn't require words, where you can sit side by side, staring into the fire, each lost in your own thoughts, and still feel connected. It's a rare thing to be comfortable with someone in that way, and the men who found it cherished it. Of course, not all partnerships were harmonious. Put two people together in close quarters, under stressful conditions, for months on end, and there's bound to be friction. Arguments over how to set the traps, over who's pulling their weight, over something as petty as who ate the last of the sugar. Most of these disputes were resolved with words. Heated words, sometimes, but words nonetheless. Occasionally, they escalated to blows, a quick, brutal scuffle that ended with both men bruised and panting, glaring at each other across the fire. And then, because they had no choice, they'd make peace. They'd grumble apologies, share a drink from the whiskey flask if they had any, and get back to the business of surviving. Because out here, you couldn't afford to hold grudges. Your partner was all that stood between you and complete isolation, and isolation could kill you faster than the cold. Let's talk about a meal that was often shared among trappers: roasted meat on a spit. When a group of trappers brought down a large animal, an elk or a bighorn sheep, they'd butcher it together and then roast big chunks of meat over a communal fire. Picture it, a haunch of elk, speared on a green branch and propped over the flames, fat dripping and hissing into the coals, sending up little bursts of smoke and flame. The smell is incredible, smoky, rich, savory. Your mouth waters just from being near it. The men would sit around the fire, waiting for the meat to cook, talking and laughing and passing around a flask of whiskey or a pipe of tobacco. When the meat was ready, charred on the outside, tender and juicy on the inside, they'd carve off pieces with their knives and eat with their hands, grease running down their chins and fingers. There's something primal and satisfying about eating this way, about tearing into a piece of meat you hunted and cooked yourself, surrounded by people who depend on you and whom you depend on in turn. It's a reminder of an older way of living before plates and forks and grocery stores, when food was something you worked for and shared. Some trappers would season their meat with wild herbs they'd foraged, sage, wild onions, sometimes even juniper berries, which added a piney, slightly citrus flavor that complemented the richness of the meat. Others preferred it plain, letting the natural flavor of the game shine through. And afterward, when everyone was full and the fire was burning low, someone might pull out a fiddle or a harmonica. Music was a precious commodity in the mountains, a way to bring a little bit of culture and comfort to the wild. The tunes were often simple, folk songs, dance tunes, hymns, but they filled the night with something other than wind and silence. Men would tap their feet, clap their hands, even get up and dance if the mood struck them, spinning around the fire with a kind of joyful abandon that seems almost childlike. And for a little while, the cold and the loneliness and the danger would fade away, replaced by the warmth of human connection. The annual rendezvous was the high point of the social calendar for mountain men. Once a year, usually in summer, trappers from all over the Rockies would converge on a predetermined location, a wide meadow near a river, usually to trade their furs, resupply, and reconnect with other human beings. The rendezvous was part trade fair, part carnival, part reunion. Hundreds of people would gather, trappers, traders, native peoples, even a few adventurous tourists from the East who wanted to see the Wild West for themselves. There would be competitions, shooting contests, wrestling matches, horse races, with prizes and bragging rights on the line. There would be feasting with whole buffalo roasted over enormous fires and barrels of whiskey that flowed freely, perhaps too freely. There would be storytelling around the campfires, tales growing taller with each retelling. And there would be trade. Trappers would bring their bundles of beaver pelts, sometimes a year's worth of work, and exchange them for goods, ammunition, knives, blankets, coffee, sugar, tobacco, all the things they couldn't make or find in the wilderness. The traders, representing the big fur companies, would haggle and bargain, trying to get the best deal. The trappers, knowing this was their only chance for months, would haggle right back. But more than the trade or the competitions or even the whiskey, the rendezvous was about connection. It was a chance to see old friends, to make new ones, to hear news from the outside world, to remember that you weren't alone in this vast wilderness. And when the rendezvous was over, when the last trade was made and the camps started to break up, the trappers would head back into the mountains, back to their solitary or small group existence. But they'd carry the memory of those few days with them, a warmth that would sustain them through the long months ahead. Now, let's talk about a sweet treat that sometimes made an appearance at the rendezvous or in a trapper's pack if he'd been smart: molasses. Molasses was thick, dark, and intensely sweet, with a rich, almost smoky flavor that was like nothing else. A small jar of molasses was valuable, both as a trade good and as a personal luxury. You could drizzle it over your johnny cakes or hardtack, turning a bland meal into something almost dessert-like. You could stir it into your coffee for a hit of sweetness and energy. Or you could just take a spoonful straight, letting the thick syrup coat your tongue and fill your mouth with rich, complex sweetness. Some trappers would mix molasses with water to make a kind of rough syrup, which they'd sip slowly on cold nights. It wasn't fancy, but it was comforting, a small indulgence that made the hard life a little more bearable. There's a saying that goes, "Misery loves company," but I think the opposite is just as true: joy loves company. The happiest moments in the mountains, the times when the trappers felt most alive, were often the times when they were together, sharing a meal, telling a story, singing a song, or just sitting in companionable silence. Because humans are social creatures. We need connection, even those of us who crave solitude. And the mountain men, for all their rugged independence, understood that. They might spend weeks or months alone, but they always sought out others eventually, drawn by that fundamental need to be seen, to be known, to be part of something larger than themselves. And now, let your mind drift to the final chapter, where we'll bring our journey to a close, reflecting on the lessons of the mountain men and the quiet dignity of a life lived on the edge. As winter begins to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appear, a patch of bare ground where the snow has melted, the tentative call of a bird returning from the south, the faint smell of thawing earth, the mountain man emerges from his shelter, blinking in the stronger sunlight, and takes stock of his situation. He's thinner, probably, leaner. His clothes are more ragged, his beard longer and more tangled. He's got frostbite scars on his fingers or toes if he wasn't careful, and his body aches in ways it didn't before winter set in. But he's alive. He made it through. There's a quiet pride in that, don't you think? Not a boastful pride, but a deep, private satisfaction. He pitted himself against the mountain, against the cold, against the long dark nights, and he won. Or at least he survived, which is its own kind of victory. The beaver will start moving again soon, coming out from their winter lodges, and the trapping season will resume. There will be work to do, pelts to gather, traps to set and check. But for now, in this liminal moment between winter and spring, there's a pause, a breath. Some trappers use this time to reflect. They think about the season that's passed, about the mistakes they made and the things they did right. They think about the friends they lost, to accidents, to illness, to the sheer harshness of the environment, and they say a quiet prayer or raise a silent toast to those who didn't make it. They think about home, too, if they have one, about the lives they left behind, the people who might or might not still remember them. Some of them wonder if it's time to go back, to return to civilization and try to fit into that world again. Others know they never will. The mountains have claimed them, and they're content with that. Let me tell you about one more meal, a spring meal that marks the end of winter's grip, fresh greens. After months of eating nothing but meat and dried goods, the first appearance of wild greens, dandelions, miner's lettuce, wild onions, is almost miraculous. The trappers would forage eagerly, gathering handfuls of the tender young plants, and eat them raw or lightly cooked. The taste was sharp, fresh, slightly bitter, a burst of flavor that was completely different from anything they'd eaten all winter. And more importantly, it was a sign: winter is over. Life is returning. These greens also helped stave off scurvy, a real concern for men who'd gone months without fresh vegetables or fruit. The vitamin C in the plants helped restore their health, gave them energy, made them feel human again. You'd boil the greens in a pot with a little water, maybe toss in some leftover meat if you had any, and eat the resulting mixture like a rough soup. It wasn't fancy, but it was fresh and vital and tasted like hope. As spring progressed, the trappers would start to prepare for the next rendezvous, gathering and bundling their pelts, making sure their gear was in order. Some would make the journey alone, others in small groups, traveling down from the high country to the designated meeting place. The journey itself was a kind of celebration, a return to the world of people and noise and commerce after months of isolation. They'd see other trappers on the trails, heading in the same direction, and there would be shouts of greeting, quick exchanges of news, promises to share a drink once they reached the rendezvous. And when they finally arrived, dusty, tired, but alive, they'd be greeted by the chaotic, joyful energy of the gathering. The cycle would begin again. But let's return to the question that started this whole journey. How did the mountain men sleep during freezing nights in the Rockies? The answer, as you've seen, is complex. They slept wrapped in buffalo robes and wool blankets, on beds of pine boughs, in dugouts and lean-tos and canvas tents. They kept fires burning, used hot stones to warm their bedrolls, and sometimes shared their sleeping spaces with dogs for extra heat. They layered their clothing, ate high-calorie foods, and developed 100 small techniques and tricks to conserve warmth. But more than any of that, they survived through sheer determination, through the willingness to endure discomfort, to accept that life was hard and then get on with living it anyway. Through resourcefulness and adaptability, learning from the land and from the native peoples who'd been thriving here for millennia. They survived because they had to, because giving up wasn't an option, because somewhere deep inside, they decided that this life, hard as it was worth living. There's something admirable about that, something almost noble in its simplicity. These weren't philosophers or poets or great thinkers. They were practical men, doing practical things, solving practical problems. But in their own way, they were heroes. Everyday heroes, the kind history often overlooks. Let me share one last food memory with you: coffee and sugar. On a spring morning after a long winter, when the sun is warm and the birds are singing and you've just emerged from your shelter to find the world green and alive, you might sit down by your fire and make a pot of real coffee, not the weak, reused grounds you've been stretching for months, but fresh, strong coffee from beans you've been saving. And maybe, just maybe, you've got a little bit of sugar left. You add a spoonful to your cup, stir it in, and take that first sip. The coffee is hot and bitter and sweet all at once, and it courses through you like a revelation. It's just coffee, but it's also so much more. It's a reminder of civilization, of comfort, of all the small pleasures you'd been doing without. You sit there, cradling the warm cup in your hands, and you watch the sun climb higher into the sky. You made it. You survived. And now, whatever comes next, you're ready for it. And so, dear listener, we've come to the end of our journey. We've walked through 6 months of winter with the mountain men, felt the cold bite at our fingers, tasted the rough foods that sustained them, and marveled at the quiet strength it took to survive each night. I hope this story has carried you gently towards sleep, that the crackling fires and soft snowfall and distant wolf howls have lulled you into that peaceful, drifting state. If you're still awake, don't worry. Let your mind rest on these images: a warm buffalo robe, a banked fire glowing in the darkness, the vast starry sky above the Rockies. Let yourself sink deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing slow. Let the story fade into dreams. And if this peaceful drift into history helped you unwind, if it gave you a few moments of calm in a busy world, I'd love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments which chapter was your favorite, or share your own thoughts about the mountain men and their remarkable lives. And if you'd like more journeys like this, more quiet explorations of history's forgotten corners, tap that subscribe button. Only if it feels right, of course. Thank you for joining me tonight, friends. Thank you for letting me be your guide through the frozen Rockies, through the long winter nights and the small, warm moments of survival. Sweet dreams. Rest well. And I'll see you next time when we drift into another story together. Softly good night.